So at this stage, right here, after these two buffer subdata calls, we have our GPU memory populated with our arrays that describes colors and vertex positions, XYZ and RGBA. So this is now in GPU memory. So these calls push this information into GPU memory. Now our task is to position our inputs inside the vertex shader to the correct places here. So the first step is that we use names of these two input vectors inside the vertex program, and we say shader program ID, what is the unique position, that's called position, in this shader for s_v position and likewise s_v color. And this gives us two identifiers that basically represent these two input vectors in our shader. So we sort of make their identification in our client program. And then we need to essentially use them as pointers to the appropriate placement in this memory. And we make these two calls. We say that for the position ID, which is position of the coordinates, we're going to specify offset 0. And so when we call this vertex attribute pointer, we set this vector to look at offset 0 in our memory buffer right here, and this is the last parameter here is 0, so this is the offset 0, basically the beginning here. We also tell that the type of value stored here is floating point number, and we say that we will be loading here 3 components at a time. And so this is where our input vector will be getting information for every vertex when the vertex shader program is executed. Likewise, we say color ID, which is the position of this input, is going to be set at this offset, which just remained from the loading, so it's just offset that's pointing to this position. So this color is set right here. So these are the two calls that specify where exactly these two input vectors are going to get information from GPU memory. So the GPU memory is already populated. Then we say use program shader program ID, and then the important thing is that after all this effort to configure everything and make connection of everything in this manner, we also have to say enable vertex attribute array position ID and color ID, because sometimes the shader can run without them being enabled, and then the input will just not be processed at all. So that's just part of the flexibility. So in order for the data to start flowing into these inputs, we have to say enable vertex attribute array. So overall, I just want to say that attribute array and array is all about structure, and our structure is basically these like XYZ type of coordinates and RGB type of colors that we specify. So attributes essentially correspond to the structure of data, how these arrays, what kind of data do they contain, what is the structure of the data. And when we're talking about the buffers, we're talking about the memory inside the GPU, and you can see that there's lots of flexibility and multiple ways to configure memory buffers. There are different kinds of memory buffers inside the GPU, so this is the effort that we make here in the sample to set up everything properly, and now the program is ready to start executing. And at the bottom of this, we enter something that we call glut main loop. So the main loop eventually, or pretty soon rather, will invoke our render function. And the render function, which we specified as our display function, right? So back to the top of our main function. So this is our render function. Okay, it's right here. So our render function basically is going to clear everything, clear the background, basically make the frame blank, and then call draw arrays, and that means triangles. So that means that we're going to draw our arrays. Remember, I told you arrays are synonymous in GL terminology to structures. Right, so our structures are arrays of floating point numbers, and in this case we're going to recognize them as triangles, of course made up of three floating point numbers, and that's going to end up in our position, which will be passed over to the global output position for this vertex shader, and so our vertices will end up in the right places. And so this drawing is done in GPU memory, and when we call glut swap buffers, this causes the new frame to be shown on the screen. And the next time we render, again, we can do new things to create this more animated, but that's the process. Basically, we'll be drawing these arrays that we already loaded into GPU memory, and then glut swap buffers make the next frame available. So we don't control when render is invoked. It's the hardware decides when to call render to make things visible. So let's give this a quick try. So we'll call file new, I actually open project, and I'll just navigate to GL262 example, and this is our example talking about these memory buffers, and I'm going to open this solution, which asks me for an upgrade. I'm going to say OK. So this upgrade happens, and now I'm just going to press Ctrl F5 to quickly compile and run, and this is the outcome. So this is the triangle that gets rendered, and recall that what we specified here is that our top our lower left is red, and the lower right is green, and the top is blue right here. So, and these are the coordinates. So this is the result of this example. And of course, we need to also discuss how these fragments are populated with these fancy colors that kind of flow from one to another. And this is due to the interpolation. So this will be part of our next laboratory exercise.